The 101st Airborne Division activated in August 1942 with no combat record and no battle history, and within 2 years had become the one American military unit that German commanders feared above all others on the Western Front. That fear had nothing to do with luck and nothing to do with numbers. Built engagement by engagement, from the hedgerows of Normandy to the frozen roads outside a small Belgian town called Bastogne, it was earned the hard way. And today, we are going to walk through every piece of that story. The battles, the men who fought them, and the specific reasons German soldiers found this particular division unlike anything else they faced. August 16, 1942. Camp Claiborne, Louisiana. The 101st Airborne Division came into existence that day through one of the bluntest personnel decisions in Army history. Soldiers from the existing 82nd Infantry Division were lined up, their names were called, and they went to one unit or the other. No drama, no ceremony. You were in the 82nd or you were in the new 101st, and from that moment forward, those two units developed completely different identities and competed fiercely with each other for the rest of the war. Standing in front of his new division that day, Major General William C. Lee delivered a sentence that turned out to be one of the most accurate predictions any military officer ever made. His exact words were, "The 101st Airborne Division has no history, but it has a rendezvous with destiny." That line became the division's motto, and if you spend any time with what happened next, you understand exactly why it stuck. The nickname Screaming Eagles came from the division's insignia, a bald eagle on a black shield borrowed from Old Abe, the living mascot that the 8th Wisconsin Volunteer Infantry Regiment had carried into battle during the Civil War. When that bird went into combat, it screamed, and the 101st eventually adopted both the image and the name. What actually separated these men from a standard infantry division, though, had nothing to do with insignia and everything to do with how they got there in the first place. Every single paratrooper in the 101st was a volunteer who had specifically requested airborne duty, passed a demanding physical selection process, and trained for a job that most soldiers in the Army never wanted. Nobody ended up in the 101st by accident, and that self-selection process produced units with a level of aggression and cohesion that was very difficult to build in conscript formations. The extra $50 a month in hazard pay was real, and it mattered to men in 1942, but money was not what drove enlistment into the paratroopers. What drove it was the kind of man who, when asked if he wanted to jump out of an aircraft at night into enemy territory, raised his hand. That psychological profile, competitive, independent, and willing to operate in isolation without waiting for orders, shaped everything the 101st did in combat. Training was built around that reality. Soldiers were conditioned to fight alone, to find other soldiers in the dark, to improvise objectives when original orders became impossible. The 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, one of the 101st's core units, trained at Camp Toccoa, Georgia, where the daily routine included running up and down Currahee Mountain repeatedly, with the phrase, 3 miles up, 3 miles down, becoming something close to a religious mantra. The goal was not only physical conditioning, it was teaching men to function at the limit of their capacity and keep functioning when everything around them had gone wrong. General Lee suffered a heart attack in February 1944 and never commanded the division in combat. Major General Maxwell D. Taylor replaced him and led the Screaming Eagles into their first combat jump. And by the spring of 1944, after months of training in England that had begun in September 1943, the division was ready for whatever came next. What came next was Normandy, the first drop. D-Day, June 6, 1944. Most people picture D-Day as beaches, landing craft, water, men fighting their way ashore at dawn. That picture is accurate, and it happened, but before any of it, in the darkness between 12:48 and 1:40 in the morning on June 6, 1944, the men of the 101st Airborne were already exiting aircraft over occupied France. They were the first Allied soldiers on French soil that day, and their mission was what made the beach landings possible at all. Utah Beach, the westernmost American landing zone, sat behind a series of causeways crossing flooded low ground, and infantry coming ashore could only advance inland if those causeways were open and held. Securing them fell to the 101st, which meant jumping behind the German lines hours before the seaborne assault began, and fighting through to those exits before the beach troops even arrived. Without the 101st holding those causeways, Utah Beach could have become a killing ground with no way out. In practice, the drop went badly from the start. Flak, clouds, and the sheer chaos of low-altitude night flying over defended territory scattered paratroopers across a wide area of Normandy, many landing miles from their intended zones. By the end of D-Day, General Taylor had direct control of roughly 2,500 soldiers out of the 6,600 who had boarded the aircraft, and nearly 1,500 paratroopers were captured or killed just on landing before they ever fired a shot at an organized enemy position. And that's when something unexpected happened. The scattered drop, which looked like a disaster from the American side, turned out to terrify the Germans in ways that a clean, concentrated drop never would have. Defenders across a wide area of Normandy heard combat erupting in multiple directions at once, with no way to locate the main threat or determine how large the attacking force was. Units fell back from positions they were holding against opponents who were often numerically weaker, because firefights breaking out everywhere convinced them they faced a massive coordinated operation. The 101st seemed to be everywhere at once, which is a very different problem than facing an enemy you can locate and fix in place. One small engagement that morning captured everything about what the 101st was capable of at its best. Lieutenant Richard Winters of Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, 506th Manor, gathered 13 men and led them against a fortified German battery of 4 105mm artillery guns actively targeting the Utah Beach landing force. 13 men against a force 3 to 4 times that size in a prepared position. Winters attacked anyway, maneuvered under fire, outflanked the position, and destroyed all 4 guns, earning the Distinguished Service Cross for the action. Decades later, that assault at Brecourt Manor became required study at West Point, a model for how small units should fight when they're outnumbered, and the mission demands results regardless. D-Day was supposed to last about 3 days for the 101st. The division stayed in Normandy for 6 weeks, and the hardest stretch of those 6 weeks came just days after the initial landing at a town called Carentan. Connecting Utah Beach to Omaha Beach required controlling Carentan, which sat between the 2 landing zones. Without it, the American beachheads remained separated and could be defeated one at a time, and the Germans understood this as well as the Americans did. Major Friedrich von der Heydte commanded the defense, leading the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, German paratroopers, some of the best soldiers in the Wehrmacht, with orders to hold the town regardless of cost. The main approach into Carentan ran along a narrow causeway with flat, exposed ground on both sides and no cover anywhere. Soldiers advancing down that road were channeled into a kill zone, and the men who walked it gave it a name before the battle was over: Purple Heart Lane. Fighting through that causeway, and then through the streets of the town, the 101st captured Carentan on June 12, 1944. And then the Germans came back. June 13th brought what soldiers called the Battle of Bloody Gulch, a full counterattack built around the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, backed by surviving elements of von der Heydte's paratroopers, pushing hard to retake the town with tank support. The 101st stopped them, held the line, and kept the town. What that 3-day sequence tells you is worth pausing on. Capturing a heavily defended causeway so dangerous it earned a name during the fight, taking the town from elite German paratroopers ordered to die before retreating, and then turning around to beat back an SS armored counterattack all within roughly 72 hours was not what conventional military expectations suggested was possible. When the division finally returned to England in July 1944, the Germans defending Normandy had watched them operate in night drops, scattered small unit firefights, defended causeways, street fighting, and open-field defensive combat. Every single time, the result was the same. After returning to England for rest and retraining, the 101st came back into action on September 17, 1944, as part of one of the largest airborne operations in history. Field Marshal Montgomery's plan, Operation Market Garden, called for dropping 3 Allied airborne divisions into the Netherlands in broad daylight to seize a corridor of river and canal bridges, hold a long road open, and allow armored forces to race through to the Rhine and into Germany's industrial heartland. The stated goal was to end the war by Christmas. The 101st drew the southernmost sector of the operation, a corridor stretching approximately 16 miles that included the city of Eindhoven, a canal crossing at Saône, and the towns of Veghel and Sint-Oedenrode. 16 miles of objectives was more ground than any other division in the operation had to cover. Eindhoven fell on September 17th and 18th. At Saône, German engineers blew the bridge over the Wilhelmina Canal before it could be seized, which meant Allied engineers had to build a replacement crossing while the clock on the entire operation was already running. The road itself, Hell's Highway, as American soldiers came to call it, became the focus of relentless German counterattack pressure for the 72 days the 101st held it. German commanders knew that cutting the highway would strangle the entire operation, so they attacked it repeatedly, with infantry, with armor, with whatever force they could bring to bear. Over 72 consecutive days of combat, the 101st absorbed every one of those attacks and kept the road open, with no sustained rest, no clean breaks, just continuous pressure and continuous fighting. The division returned to France on November 28, 1944, having added another entry to a record that was becoming very difficult to argue with. What nobody in the division knew yet was that the rest period in France would be shorter than anyone expected, because something was building in the Ardennes that would demand more from the 101st than anything that had come before. December 16, 1944. Hitler launched his last major offensive in the West, sending 400,000 troops and more than 1,000 armored vehicles through the Ardennes forest in Belgium and Luxembourg. Operation Watch on the Rhine, the Battle of the Bulge, as history came to call it, had one strategic purpose: reach the Meuse River, capture the port of Antwerp, split the Allied armies apart, and reverse the course of the war. This was the all-or-nothing gamble, and it hit at the weakest point in the Allied line, a lightly defended sector where exhausted American units had been told the Ardennes was a quiet posting. At the center of the German plan sat a small Belgian crossroads town called Bastogne. 7 major roads met there, and the Germans had a specific name for it. They called it a road octopus. Moving armored forces quickly through the Dachau, Ardennes in winter required those roads, and without Bastogne, the offensive could not reach its objectives on schedule. General Eisenhower understood this the day after the attack started, and on December 17th, he ordered the 101st Airborne to move to Bastogne without delay. The problem was that the 101st was resting in France. Full winter equipment had not been issued, many men were on leave, and Division Commander General Maxwell Taylor was in Washington, D.C. for meetings, which meant command passed to Brigadier General Anthony C. McAuliffe. McAuliffe loaded his men onto open trucks with no enclosed transport and no heating, just soldiers in whatever gear they had sitting in the back of vehicles in the Belgian winter, and drove them more than 100 miles toward a front that was actively collapsing around them. They arrived in Bastogne with exactly 4 hours to spare before the leading German forces closed the ring around the town. By December 21, 1944, the encirclement was complete. Bastogne was cut off, surrounded, isolated, with no way in and no way out. Inside the perimeter, McAuliffe had 4 airborne regiments, 7 artillery battalions, a tank destroyer battalion, and tanks and engineers from the 10th Armored Division. Outside the perimeter, as McAuliffe would note in a Christmas Eve message to his troops, stood 4 German panzer divisions, 2 German infantry divisions, and 1 German parachute division. By some estimates, the defenders were outnumbered 5-1. Ammunition rationing had started. Medical supplies were critically low, and the cold weather gear the division had left behind in France was sitting far away and entirely useless, while the Belgian winter delivered exactly the conditions you would expect. None of that was the worst part. The worst part was that overcast weather had grounded every Allied aircraft in the region. No close air support, no aerial resupply, and no relief coming from the sky while the ground routes were closed. On the morning of December 22nd, at around 11:30 a.m., 4 German soldiers appeared at American lines carrying white flags and a briefcase. Escorted to a command post, they presented a formal written ultimatum signed by General Heinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz, the German commander outside the perimeter. The document was confident almost to the point of being theatrical. It described the Americans as completely encircled, identified the artillery corps, and 6 anti-aircraft battalions standing ready to destroy the town, and offered the surrounded force exactly one option for avoiding what it called total annihilation. The American commander had 2 hours to comply. When the message reached McAuliffe, he was waking from sleep, catching a few hours' rest in the middle of a siege. He read the ultimatum, and his first reaction, immediate and dismissive, came out as 2 words: "Aw, nuts." Then he went back to other business. The staff needed a formal written reply. Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard pointed out that what the general had just said pretty well captured the situation, and the room agreed with considerable enthusiasm. McAuliffe sat down and typed the official American response to the German demand for surrender. To the German commander, nuts, the American commander. Colonel Joseph Harper of the 327th Glider Infantry delivered it in person to the German delegation. When the German officers said they did not understand what the word meant, Harper told them directly that in plain English it was the same as "go to hell." That reply circled the world within days. German artillery barrages and infantry attacks continued, and the Luftwaffe bombed the town for 4 consecutive nights. The 101st held the perimeter through all of it, and not one of those German divisions, 4 panzer, 2 infantry, 1 parachute, managed to break through. December the 23rd brought clear skies for the first time in days. Allied aircraft were immediately over the Ardennes. Supply, drops falling to the men inside Bastogne, fighters going after German armor on the surrounding roads. The pressure did not end, but it eased enough to confirm what the men inside the perimeter had already demonstrated. The line was holding. 3 days later, on December 26th, lead elements of General George Patton's Third Army, specifically the 4th Armored Division, punched through the German encirclement and opened a corridor into Bastogne. The siege was over. Patton was not a man who handed out praise casually, and his assessment of what the 101st had accomplished at Bastogne was direct: the most brilliant operation we have thus far performed. On December 30th, just 4 days after the relief, Patton personally awarded McAuliffe the Distinguished Service Cross, and the Army recognized the defense of Bastogne with the first Presidential Distinguished Unit citation ever awarded to an entire division, the highest honor available to a military unit. 482 men killed, 2,449 wounded, 527 missing or captured. Those numbers represent only the cost of holding one town in one battle, and they came from a division that had been resting in France less than 2 weeks earlier, surrounded 5-1, running short of everything, holding against Hitler's last and largest offensive in the West. January 25, 1945, when the Battle of the Bulge officially ended, total American casualties across the entire operation had exceeded 100,000. Now we have everything on the table: D-Day, Carentan, Market Garden, Bastogne. The answer to the question this video started with comes down to 4 things, and none of them are complicated. The first was selection. German soldiers were experienced enough to recognize the difference between a drafted conscript and a man who had volunteered for the hardest job in the Army. Every paratrooper across from them had raised his hand, passed a demanding physical, process, and trained specifically for operating behind enemy lines without support. Germany had its own elite airborne soldiers, the Fallschirmjäger, among the most celebrated troops in the Wehrmacht, and facing Allied paratroopers who matched their aggression while exceeding them in tactical independence, removed a psychological edge the Germans had depended on since the early years of the war. The second was the chaos effect. On D-Day, a scattered drop created the impression of a force everywhere at once. German units inflated their threat estimates, fell back from defended positions against opponents who were often numerically weaker, and could not locate the main attack because there was no single main attack. There were dozens of small ones erupting across a wide area at the same time. Paratroopers appeared behind front lines, in places the front line was supposed to protect, at night without warning. There was no conventional defensive answer to that problem. The third reason was what happened every time the Germans tried to push them off ground. Purple Heart Lane and Bloody Gulch at Carentan, 72 days on Hell's Highway, the siege at Bastogne. Each time, German commanders applied force that should have produced withdrawal, surrender, or collapse, and each time the 101st absorbed it and fought back. At Bastogne, surrounded 5-1, running short of everything, told they faced total annihilation. McAuliffe's response was a word that soldiers still quote 8 decades later. The Germans had no template for an opponent who received a formal ultimatum listing the artillery about to destroy them, and replied with a single word that meant no. The fourth reason was cumulative weight. One engagement builds a reputation. 4 engagements, each one more demanding than the last, build something qualitatively different. One German veteran who had fought against multiple American formations put it plainly: of all the American organizations he opposed, the 101st Airborne was the one he feared the most. That judgment was not aesthetic. It came from watching a unit absorb punishment that would have destroyed other formations and keep coming anyway. After Bastogne, the 101st kept fighting through the final months of the war in Europe, and 2 moments from those last weeks carry a weight that is hard to overstate. Late April 1945. The Screaming Eagles reached Kaufering 4, a sub-camp in the Dachau concentration camp network, and found approximately 500 dead prisoners. The SS had burned the barracks before retreating. The 101st was later formally recognized as a liberating unit by both the U.S. Army Center of Military History and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, that recognition coming in 1998. And then, in the final days of the war in Europe, the division made its way to the Bavarian Alps and reached Berchtesgaden, Hitler's personal mountain retreat. The Screaming Eagles walked into Hitler's house at the end of the war. The division that German commanders had identified as their most feared American opponent captured the sanctuary of the man who had sent those commanders to stop them. You cannot write a more fitting conclusion than that one. November 30th, 1945, Germany. The 101st Airborne Division was inactivated 3 years and a few months after General Lee stood in front of his new division and told them they had a rendezvous with destiny. 2,155 men killed in action, more than 9,300 battle casualties across all categories. 2 presidential unit citations, 4 campaign streamers, 13 unit decorations. What the Germans encountered in the 101st was a division built from the ground up around volunteers who had trained for the worst possible circumstances. And then, when those circumstances arrived, responded exactly the way their culture had prepared them to respond, not with hesitation, not with a request for better odds, and not with a surrender document, but with a single word that their general typed out in a besieged Belgian town on December 22, 1944, in the middle of what the Germans had promised would be total annihilation. The town square in Bastogne, Belgium, is named Place General McAuliffe. A Sherman tank pierced by a German 88mm shell stands in one corner, and the word "nuts" appears on a monument nearby. The people of Bastogne have been maintaining that square for 80 years, which tells you exactly how the people who lived through the siege feel about the men who held it. The Screaming Eagles earned that name, and they earned the fear of every German commander who faced them. That fear was the most honest thing their enemies ever gave them.